North Carolina celebrates a couple of major school choice anniversaries this month, and our next guest came to the Tar Heel State to help mark one of those milestones. Corey DeAngelis is the National Director of Research at the American Federation for Children, the Executive Director at Educational Freedom Institute, an adjunct scholar at the Libertarian Cato Institute, and Senior Fellow at Reason Foundation. He's also co-editor of the recent book, School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. Phew, lots of titles. So, Corey, you are here because of the important 25th anniversary of North Carolina's charter school law. As someone who looks at school choice across the country, how significant is this?
I mean, this is huge. Look, there are some states that don't even have charter school laws on the books. So North Carolina having charter schools for 25 years is a huge, significant milestone, and it means a lot for those individual families who are seeking out these options for their children. I believe over 8% of the public school population is actually in a public charter school in North Carolina, and there are over 70,000 names on wait lists to get into charter schools. So families are seeking out these options, and I think it's a really interesting time to talk about this milestone this year in particular, based on the latest data that I've seen over the past year in enrollment trends. The traditional schools have lost about 5% of their enrollment in North Carolina, but North Carolina charter schools, on the other hand, have seen about a 7% increase in their student enrollment. So families are re-evaluating how they view education and different types of educational settings. And what we're seeing over the past year is that a lot of families are figuring out that charter schools have done a very good job. So they're voting with their feet towards the charter school sector.
This is important, obviously, for those of us here in North Carolina, but from the national perspective, you mentioned some states don't even have a charter school law. Seeing a state reach 25 years, does that offer some positive news for states that might want to expand this?
Yeah, absolutely. It shows other states that they can do this, and that North Carolina has shown consistently that charter schools can perform well. They're accountable to families. They're directly accountable to families. If a charter school underperforms, it shuts down. If a government-run school underperforms, it typically gets more money. The incentives are exactly aligned in the right way in the charter school sector and in the private school sector as well, where these institutions have an incentive to cater to the needs of their customers because they have to attract enrollment in order to stay in business. And this should lead to the traditional schools doing better as well because of competitive pressures, that if the traditional schools see that they might lose some of the funding associated with the child through their competition, they'll raise their game and do a better job over time. That's typically what we've seen in states with school choice.
You are here specifically for the 25th anniversary of the charter school law, but I mentioned at the outset that there's another significant school choice anniversary, and that was celebrated just a few days earlier, and that is the 10th anniversary of then Democratic Governor Beverly Perdue signing the law that got rid of North Carolina's longstanding charter school cap. That has to be, if not as significant as a charter school law itself, pretty significant.
Yeah, that's huge. There shouldn't have been a cap in the first place. Why should a family be trapped in a particular school just to protect the monopoly and not be allowed to switch to a school that they would prefer for their child? If charter school enrollment is going to grow at a particular rate at any year, that should be allowed if the choice is in the hands of the families. So there shouldn't have been a cap in the first place. That was just a way for the monopoly to protect itself at the expense of families. We should allow families to vote with their feet, regardless of the type of school that works best for them and the funding that is meant for their child. I mean, education dollars are meant for educating children, not for propping up a particular institution or protecting a particular type of system, whether that's traditional, charter, or private. That money should follow the child to wherever they're getting the best education, and that decision should be in the hands of the families, not bureaucrats.
We've talked about significant growth in charter schools and school choice, but there are a lot of people who still have some misconceptions about it. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the book that you recently co-edited, School Choice Myths: Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. Title seems to say it all, but what were you trying to do with this book in exposing some myths about choice?
Yeah, this is co-edited with Neil McCluskey from the Cato Institute, and we point out 12 of the biggest myths in the school choice debate. One of them that everybody has heard listening to this conversation is that in one way or another, school choice defunds public schools. My first response to that is, well, if you're confident in your product and you're doing a good job in the public school system, why would giving a family a choice defund or destroy your institution? That tells me that you're not that confident in the services that you're providing. That's a strong argument for school choice, not against it. My second response to that argument is school choice doesn't defund public schools. If anything, government schools defund families. School choice initiatives just return the money to the hands of the rightful owners. And you can take that money to the traditional school if you want. But if not, you should be able to take that money to a charter school or a private school. You should even be able to use that funding for home-based instruction as well. The money should follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. Just think about it this way. If you would think it would be absolutely ridiculous for anyone to try to make the argument that allowing families to choose their grocery store defunded Walmart or defunded Safeway. That wouldn't make any sense, and everybody would understand that that is an absurd argument to make, because everybody understands that your grocery money doesn't belong to any particular institution, Walmart or Safeway or any other type of provider. Similarly with K-12 education funding belongs to the family. It doesn't belong to the public school or the private school or the charter school. It should follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. My third response to that is, this is true in North Carolina as it is in any other state, that although schools are funded partially based on enrollment counts, they aren't completely funded based on enrollment counts. So what that means mathematically is when a traditional school loses a student to their competition, they lose some funding, but they don't lose all of it. So mathematically, they end up with more money per student that remains in the public school system. So they actually financially benefit on a per pupil basis. Just imagine if you left Safeway and started shopping at Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, and Safeway got to keep 20% of your funding for groceries in perpetuity. That would be ridiculous, but it would be a good deal for Safeway. And I'd argue that similarly, because traditional schools get to keep money for students that are no longer educating, that's actually a good deal for them as well. So they should be celebrating school choice. They should not be against it. And then, as I pointed out earlier, school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats. Competition leads to better outcomes in the traditional sector as well.
You mentioned that there are a dozen myths that are addressed in this book. If you'd like to learn more about them, the title of the book, once again, is School Choice Myths: Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. Before we wrap it up, you're here in North Carolina to help lawmakers, policymakers, people interested in education mark this 25th anniversary of North Carolina's charter school law. As we look at this milestone, what do you as a school choice advocate hope these folks will keep in mind as the next steps, or what happens next in either charter schools or school choice in general?
I think we should keep in mind the reason that the education system exists. The education system exists to meet the needs of students and their families, not the other way around. It's about time we get our priorities right and fund students as opposed to institutions. So charter schools in North Carolina are a step in the right direction. I'm glad that families have that type of educational freedom, but North Carolina shouldn't stop there. North Carolina also has something called opportunity scholarship programs, where the funding can follow the child to a private school as well, even religious private schools. That's the step forward, I believe, and we should continue expanding charter schools as well. But we should allow the funding to follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. It shouldn't be limited to traditional schools and charter schools. Families should be able to access private schools and home-based options as well. And this is where I start talking about something that I call funding students as opposed to systems. And what's interesting here is a lot of the people who do not support expanding funding students when it comes to K-12 education. They do support it when it comes to higher education with Pell Grants and the GI Bill, for example. The funding goes to the student, and they could take it to the public community college if they want, but they could also take it to a private religious or non-religious university. We do the same thing with pre-K programs. For example, with the federal Head Start program and other taxpayer-funded pre-K programs, the funding goes to the family, and they're rightfully able to choose public or private religious or non-religious providers. I'm just arguing we should apply the same logic to K-12 education and fund the student as opposed to the institution. The difference there, though, I believe, is that there's a logical inconsistency, or an apparent logical inconsistency, because choice is the norm when it comes to higher education and pre-K and just about any other industry in the United States, but choice threatens an entrenched special interest that profits from getting your children's education dollars regardless of how well they do, regardless of the choice of the family, and from what we've seen over the past year, regardless of whether they even open their doors for business. So they fight really hard, and they perpetuate these myths year after year in order to protect it themselves at the expense of the families. It's about time we reverse that and prioritize the families over the system.
If you'd like to learn more about school choice, the book, once again, is School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. Its co-editor is Corey DeAngelis, National Director of Research at the American Federation for Children. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.